everybody, welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to share with you something a little bit different. I know I've been giving a lot of movie reviews for the spooky season, Halloween season that's upcoming, but I figured since we're about a week away from Halloween itself, that we should probably just give more of a list, not necessarily go full review, movie by movie, just recommendations that I would say that these are totally worth watching during this time. Now, I did pick out a couple of different categories. Each one is going to have a couple of picks for various scenarios, depending on if you're with family or just want to watch something a little bit more gory, things like that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the list of the best Halloween movies or the best movies to watch around this spooky season. Now, the first category I wanted to cover was slashers. Now, this is probably my favorite, personally, genre of horror movies. I like them the best. I know they're not everyone's favorite, but here are a couple that I find to be the more quintessential slasher films. And of course, we have to start with the staple, the one that not necessarily started it all, but definitely had a major impact on what horror movies and slashers are, and that is with Halloween. This one is a classic. There's not much that needs to be more said about it. It's been said every single Halloween. Somebody's always reviewing it. But this one is hands down a classic, and that's really all you need for a Halloween movie. Next up, we have A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, this one is the one that terrified me as a kid. I actually left a sleepover party as a kid when we watched this because it terrified me that much. Freddy Krueger has always been that character that's creeped me out the most. Now, mind you, he's become more comedic, and as I've gotten older, it's not nearly as traumatizing, but it was definitely traumatizing when I was like 7 or 8. Seeing this character that could attack you and kill you in your dreams definitely freaked me out then, but it's totally worth watching the original for sure. And next up, we have Scream. Now, this one was my favorite as a teen, and I think it very much captured everything that I wanted in a slasher movie. It did have a slasher killer, obviously, but the way that it was presented in tropes of movies, the way that that blends with real life and how things can be sort of perceived and how they're basing a lot of their kills off of movies and being a massive movie nerd. There's a scene in a blockbuster. It just called out to my nerdness, but I feel like that just captured everything that I loved about a slasher and a horror movie, plus being a movie nerd. It just combined everything perfectly. And next up, we have the Friday the 13th franchise. Now, I say franchise because some are obviously better than others, but I do feel like once Jason Voorhees does show up, starting more in like 2 and beyond, that's where it really took off. He is essentially that silent killer, very much like Michael Myers in the Halloween films, but there's just a lot more of a brutality to Jason that I think just brings a lot more fun to the character, whereas Michael's just a little bit more hyper-focused on killing someone. Jason's just taking out anyone and everyone that's in his path for really no reason, and that's what makes it so much more fun. And finally, in the slasher list, I have Child's Play. Now, I didn't put the reboot, I put the original, and the reason why I like Child's Play so much is because the idea of how a killer can be put into a body of a toy and still sort of be a killer, like his spirit. It does get a little bit more comedic as the series goes on, but I think there's just such a cult following with Chucky and Child's Play the movies that it just gets more absurd and more fun as it goes on, and you kind of forget the roots of like the killer in the body, but they add to it by like him having a bride and him having a child, and it just gets weird, but that's what kind of makes it so much fun. So up next, we have the paranormal category. Now, this is more of like the ghosts and sort of possession type of movies. I know they're not necessarily for everyone. A lot of these categories aren't for specifically anyone, but if you know some of these movies, then you'll definitely probably like a lot on this list. Now, first up has to be one of my favorites, and that's going to be It. Now, I was kind of in and out of It when it first came out, the miniseries back in the 90s. I did sort of see it, but not really, because you weren't really supposed to watch it as a kid. But I did watch the reboots, and those are fantastic, especially the first one. The second one is pretty good too, but Pennywise and Bill Skarsgård crushed it. All the acting in the reboot from 2017, and then the more recent one, I believe in 2019. They're really fun. They have a horror element. I consider them paranormal because he is sort of an extra dimensional being that can transform and do all sorts of weird stuff. So I feel like that's why it really fits in this category, but it's totally worth watching, especially the reboots. And of course, what is any possession or paranormal movie without The Exorcist? This one, very much like Halloween with the slashers, started a lot of this paranormal and possession type of movies. It was totally something that nobody had ever seen before at the time, creeped out tons and tons of audiences, drove people to the theaters, by just being this word of mouth thing, something you'd never seen before, and it blew up. And it still creeps my wife out to this day. It still definitely has those creepy scenes in it that you can be creeped out today in 2020, especially with this weird world we're living in. But it's just such a great movie that you just can't help but have a good time, but be creeped out about it the whole time. Next up, we have the Conjuring franchise. Now, there are different versions and different things throughout it, but if I had to choose the ones to recommend, I would choose the Conjuring 1 as your main one and Conjuring 2 as your second one. I wouldn't worry too much about the other franchise, the Annabelle movies or the Nun. If you're going to watch an Annabelle movie, Annabelle Creation is the far superior one, so if you're going to watch that, I recommend that. But if you want to stay in the Conjuring franchise, 1 or 2 are definitely the way to go. Definitely creeped me out in theaters. I remember being super creeped out by the Nun in the second one. It just had like this overly creepy character. Now when they decided to make her own movie, it didn't really have the same effect, but she was definitely creepy in the second one. But this franchise is heads and shoulders above a lot of what's coming out in horror nowadays. And next up we have Sinister. Now this one was very interesting on my list. I didn't see this for quite some time, but it has Ethan Hawke in it, and it's basically a character that's kind of a boogeyman that possesses kids and gets them to like put their actions kind of on tape, and they just sort of get taken by him. It's really creepy, but it's also really good. I don't really want to ruin too much about it because I think just like the overall aspect, the vibe that this movie gives off is very reminiscent of some of the classic horror movies, but kind of putting a little bit of a twist on it, plus the scary face of the actual Sinister character, whose name escapes me at this time, is definitely one of the most creepy ones I've seen as of late. And next we have Insidious. Now this one is a franchise that is ongoing still. I've only really seen up to about 3. 1 is fantastic. Second one, pretty good. 3, it's okay. But I definitely recommend watching the first one. It is so creepy. It just gives off this vibe. There's so many great visuals that will stick with you. If you've seen one of the visuals I'm talking about with a red face behind the guy, you probably know what I'm talking about. But this one has some of the best visuals, definitely some of the best paranormal actions and activities that you've probably ever seen. And speaking of paranormal activities, the next one on the list is actually Paranormal Activity. This is probably one of the most interesting of the entire series. It's very much Blair Witch style in terms of being shot camera and handheld, a lot of it, but it does it in such a special way that everything is hidden. You don't really feel, people actually believe that this was a real tape, very much like the Blair Witch Project. But this one, because I think it's more suburban, it feels more real. It could happen to you or it could happen to your neighbor, and you may never know. And I think that's what makes this one so interesting and absolutely terrifying, is it could be happening in your own home. And finally, in the paranormal category, I have one that's fairly new, but I liked it, and it actually ended up being a lot better than I thought it was going to be, and that is The Possession of Hannah Grace. Now, this one I totally didn't see coming. I didn't think it was going to be good at all. The advertisements were shoved down my throat when it was coming out in theaters, and I just felt like I made more fun of it than anything. But I had to watch it because I had made so much fun of it. Actually ended up being way better of a possession movie than I'd ever seen before. Better than a lot of like The Last Exorcisms or Haunting of Emily Rose or whatever, Last Exorcism 2. Ridiculous movies like that. It ended up being way better than I ever anticipated, so I definitely recommend checking it out. Alright, and we are moving right along into the next category, which is the thriller and psychological movies. Now, these ones are more centered on psychological things that are happening, not necessarily scary in terms of what's actually visually happening, although there are plenty of scary visuals throughout some of these movies that I'm going to suggest. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it with the first one, which is Seven. Now this has to be one of my favorite movies of all time. It's probably not considered a horror movie, but the actions and the visuals alone will scare the crap out of you. There's so many weird things that are happening, so many scary things that happen. If you know the meme of what's in the box, if you know anything about this movie, it is absolutely terrifying. And the concept of this killer using the 7 deadly sins as the reason for killing people is kind of terrifying in its own right, because then you have to kind of consider, if you want to kill someone based on that concept, the different things that you can explore. Like, they have a guy that gets killed by greed, essentially, and it's just very terrifying. There are a lot of terrifying visuals in this movie, and it's one of the best of all time. Up next, we have Get Out. Now, this one is Jordan Peele's debut movie, directorial debut, and if you don't know anything about Get Out, I mean, you've probably been living under a rock. It was one of the best movies of all time. It had such a great message hidden deep within this horror, psychological, terrible event happening to this man. It was so cool, such a great idea, totally worth watching. I love watching this and revisiting it, just trying to find all the little Easter eggs, all the little things, the breadcrumbs that lead to the end. And there's just so many different visuals and things that are packed inside of this movie that you can just rewatch it over and over and over. And with that, actually the next pick that I'm gonna go with is also Jordan Peele's, and that was his second movie, his follow-up, which is Us. Now this had to be one of the most interesting ones because I loved the concept. I know a lot of people will say it wasn't as good as Get Out, but it was also a totally different idea. The idea of this sort of, I don't want to ruin it for you, but the idea of these people that mirror you is absolutely phenomenal. I think it's very institutionalized. The way they kill people looks insane. Just a lot of the way that Jordan Peele directs and he writes, hands down phenomenal. So I highly recommend any of his movies. And a guy that I think would compare very much to Jordan Peele has to be Ari Aster. And his two movies that I know of that are phenomenal are also on my list, which is going to be Midsommar and Hereditary. Now, I say these two together because I don't want to ruin anything for you. Just watch them. They're absolutely fantastic. Totally worth it, both of them. Both are terrifying in their own way. Hereditary is more of a psychological in terms of what is going on with this family and what is exactly the traumas that are happening to them, mixed in with a sprinkle of sort of possession, I think is the best way to put it. But there are some scenes that will scare the crap out of you, and I was actually had my jaw on the floor watching this movie at several points because it was absolutely terrifying and I was completely shocked. Midsommar, on the other hand, I was shocked, but I was more invested in what was happening because it's based on more of a folklore. I think it's Scandinavian folklore. And it's just very creepy, and it gives a lot of vibes and things that, like, again, kind of like a Jordan Peele, where there's breadcrumbs leading you to the end, but you don't really know some of it when you see it. And it's one of those movies like Jordan Peele films that you have to see and pick up all those little nuances throughout the film to really get the best of it. And I think this one is definitely one of the more rewatchable ones, despite some of the more horrific things you will see. But they're both totally worth checking out. Now, since we talked a little bit about the worst of the worst in terms of like terrifying you, let's kind of lighten the mood a little bit, shall we? So let's go ahead and move on to the more family-friendly type of movies. So some of these are probably the ones you can watch with the kids, or if you are not a big fan of horror movies, just something you can watch in general, just to kind of enjoy the spooky season vibe. So first off, I have to go with Haunted Mansion. Now, I did recently release a Cinematically Late reviewing this, so it's now on the channel if you did want to check it out. But this has to be one of my more all-time favorite Disney movies, especially more live action, obviously based on the Disney World, Disneyland ride. It's not perfect, but it's definitely a fun time to watch with the kids, or just sort of enjoy a Halloween movie with some vibes to it without having to have the Halloween sticker on it. Up next, we have the Hotel Transylvania franchise. Now, this one is super fun. I love the animation of it. I love the idea of the different classic monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Invisible Man, all of these characters sort of in a hotel. Obviously, things progress as the series goes on, but every single movie in this franchise has been phenomenal. I think they're all hilarious in their own ways, and all of them are worth checking out, and great, again, for watching with the kids. Now, this next pick will be a little bit of a amalgamation and different kind of a mishmash, and that's going to be the Addams Family. Now, I'm going to put a broad stamp on this one and say the Addams Family in general. Now, I would recommend watching the live action ones, both the live action Addams Family and Addams Family Values. I believe one is available on Netflix, the other one I don't think it is. And then the Addams Family 2019 reboot, which I also did a cinematic lead on recently, available on the channel. That one is available on Amazon Prime if you have that. So all of them are worth checking out, but I highly recommend the live action ones. It'll definitely give you a bit more of an Addams Family vibe overall, and plus it a lot better fits in with the Halloween season. The new one, it fits, but I feel like it just sort of plays a little bit more to normal life, so you can really watch it at any time. But the live action ones give you that vibe. The spooky, the mansion, they're creepy, they're kooky, they're all together spooky, The Addams Family. Now next up on the list has got to be one of the most underrated Halloween season movies, and that's got to be Casper. Now this one stars Christina Ricci, which is also Wednesday Addams in the Addams Family movies, live action, that I just mentioned. But it is totally underrated, probably one of the best movies. I remember like some of the toys when they came out for this time. I think it was like Burger King or McDonald's had like these plastic toys of the different ghosts, and it was just so much cool. I think they glow in the dark if I remember correctly, but it's just a fun movie. It's got some really haunted house vibes to it, but it's also light enough for kids to watch, and you sort of get that feel again of the season, but without having to go too deep into something traumatizing and full of gore and blood. But it's definitely totally one of the ones that was worth watching in this time. And finally, for the family category, I have to recommend the Scooby-Doo movies, mainly the live action ones. Now, I know this is not necessarily of the times, but you kind of have to consider they're basically about monsters and sort of creepy things that are happening. The first movie takes place on a place called Spooky Island, for crying out loud, and the second one's about a museum of monsters and different monster characters. And that just screams Halloween to me. Plus, they're a lot of fun. I think Matthew Lillard, Freddie Prinze Jr., and Linda Cardellini and Sarah Michelle Gellar all do fantastic jobs as these live action characters. Probably a little bit old for the Scooby-Doo characters, as they're supposed to be teenagers for me, but they're all fun, and so much entertainment can be had, and so many laughs and great things that are happening. Definitely watch the Scooby-Doo movies. Plus, they're super underrated. Alright, now let's get into some chuckles. Now these are going to be the ones that are actually more comedic than scary, but they have sort of that scary undertones to them. So you can kind of have that vibe of off-putting, I guess, but you're still going to have a good time and not have to worry about jump scares for a good majority. Now the first one has to be one of the most classic ones, the ones that got me really interested in a lot of cinema, in the way things are directed, acted, portrayed, and that's Shaun of the Dead. This was one of the best movies of all time. I've been in love with Nick Frost and Simon Pegg ever since, and Edgar Wright, so I have to watch every single one of their movies. But this one in particular is the one that got me interested in it all. It is so funny. It's got the zombie vibe to it. Some scarier things, I guess, do happen, but for the most part, you're gonna have a great time laughing more than being scared. And it just fits the it totally fits the season of Halloween just with the zombies alone. But it's totally worth it. One of the best movies of all time. Up next is one that I feel like is a classic that gets very much swept under the rug and a lot of people don't remember, and that is Clue. This one is one of the funniest movies of all time. It's a murder mystery, it's a whodunit, but it's so much fun. Some creepier things do happen, but it is such a fun movie of a whodunit. So fun, so funny in terms of the characters. Tim Curry does a phenomenal job as the butler. Such a cast of characters that interact with each other so well, and I feel like is so underrated. Definitely check this one out. I believe it's also on Amazon Prime. Now another one that I also did a cinematically late for has been Killer Clowns from Outer Space. This one's currently available on Netflix, I believe it still is, but it's probably one of the weirdest movies I've ever seen. It's a B-horror movie. It's not so much funny in terms of the jokes that they're trying to do, it's just like this, it's funny that these giant sort of plasticky clowns are killing people, and I think that's what makes it so much fun. It's absurd. They wrap people up in cotton candy to sort of kidnap them or put them in balloons. All of these absurd things, but it's just so much fun. It's so funny to watch these killer clowns from outer space interact with humans and they be so nonchalant about it. It's just one of the funniest of all time. Now the next two picks are going to be kind of interesting because they're not focused on funny, but they have some funnier aspects. The first of which is going to be the Evil Dead series. Now I'm talking about the classic ones, not necessarily the reboots. Now they're funny more in Evil Dead 2 and Evil Dead 3, which is technically Army of Darkness. Those ones are the funny ones. So if you want to watch something more funny and comedic, those ones are the way to go. They do have plenty of scary elements. The overuse of blood and gore, or in like the different colors of it, things that they could get away with back then, was so interesting, and these movies are so funny. I actually watched both of them, Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness, in a record store for the first time. that was an interesting experience, and I've been in love with this franchise ever since. The reboot is definitely a scary one if you wanted to focus more on a scary Evil Dead, but Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness have to be one of the more funnier ones. Bruce Campbell is an absolute legend. And the last one in the comedic category is going to be Cabin in the Woods. Now this one I put in the comedy category because a lot of funny things happen. There's a lot of funny dialogue, despite some of the visuals being a lot more scary. But the way that it's comprised and put together from James Gunn working on it, it's just so funny the way it just mixes together. He's a genius when it comes to that. Take Guardians of the Galaxy, for example, and some of his other movies like Slither or like Super, or I think he worked on Brightburn as well. But just some of those movies that are just so kind of absurd, but just he puts the pieces together to make such a fun experience. And Cabin in the Woods has that, and it has a lot of that funny dialogue that kind of offsets some of the more absurd things or scary things that are happening. And it's just totally worth watching. Probably one of my favorite horror movies of all time. Now up next is the TV category. Now I know some people don't necessarily have the time to watch a lot of these series. There's a lot of different things happening in life that maybe just don't have the time, and a movie's going to be a lot shorter. But the in-depth of a lot of these series is what builds and makes them so terrifying in a lot of ways. So these are ones that I definitely recommend worth checking out. And the first one I have to start with is Netflix's series, The Haunting of Hill House or Bly Manor, however which one you want to call it. They are different series, have the sort of similar characters in terms of like the same actors. I think not anthology, something like that. But it's definitely one of the most scary, especially Haunting of Hill House. If you're gonna watch either one, watch that one because it is definitely one of the best acted, one of the best storylines, has some of the best scares. Bly Manor, not so much on scares, but it is a little bit creepy, but definitely watch Haunting of Hill House, one of the best horror series I've ever seen. And of course, we can't forget a horror series without talking about American Horror Story, which is the next one on this list. Now, I don't want to pinpoint a specific season. The first one I think is the most terrifying, but because each one covers a different topic, despite using the same characters, I feel like they are so creepy and terrifying in their own way. It's hard to describe. But the buzz on this series has been so abundant and out there, I don't feel like I need to talk about it too much, but mainly watch the first season and a couple of other ones. They're phenomenal. Now the next one on my list is going to be Stranger Things, and I know a lot of you will probably say that's not a horror series, but if you think about it, it kind of is. I mean, it's about like missing kids, an extra dimension, creatures, a kid with powers, so many different things that create to make this series. And there are some pretty terrifying things that happen throughout the series 1, 2, and 3. I think season 4 is still oncoming. I think they're going to end it at 4, if I remember correctly, maybe 5. But this has to be some of the more terrifying but fun sort of series. So you can have so much fun throughout maybe like 6, 7 episodes, and then you'll probably maybe have some nuggets sprinkled throughout there of sort of scarier things. But then there will be that 1 episode or 2 episodes where you're like, wow, this is actually legitimately terrifying. And that's what kind of makes it fun, is you never know when those episodes are going to pop up. They'll maybe never be in succession. And I just love Stranger Things. They're so good. Now, if you're a fan of Stephen King and you want to go with something a little bit more creepy vibe overall and not necessarily jump scares type of stuff and more based on his works, go head over to Hulu and check out Castle Rock. Now, I also did a video back in the day about the first season of this series, but it is totally worth it. One of the more interesting psychological WTF series that's out there. It's a little bit slower, but it's a slow burn in terms of action and what's happening, and it will definitely leave you some creepy vibes. And last but not least on the TV series has to be Dracula from Netflix. Now, this one I think was a dark horse. It's only about 3 episodes, but I believe it's produced and done by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, who have done the Sherlock series as well as some Doctor Who. Now, the way they bring this character to life, it's very off-putting, but you can't take your eyes away from it. There are some very scary things that happen in it, some very creepy things that happen in it, but it's so good. The little twists that they put on things, the way that they build a lot of the anticipation. Some of it you will have those WTF moments, but it is phenomenal. But the good thing about, despite it being only 3 episodes, they are very long episodes, very much like Sherlock, where they're like an hour and a half long. So you get a mini movie inside each episode, and each episode is totally worth it. Now, the last category is a little bit of a hodgepodge. It's a miscellaneous. It's ones that I wanted to mention. It's an honorable mentions, but they're not ones that I wanted to go into too much detail about, but they are definitely worth watching in this spooky season if you are a big fan of horror. So first up is The Shining, classic Stanley Kubrick, weird, has so much history with it. It's not necessarily the novel, but it's also its own thing, but it's so creepy and weird. Amazing movie. Next up is A Cure for Wellness, which has to be the one that has sat with me for a long time. Now this one hit me very hard. It's very psychological. There are plenty of creepy things that happen, but it's just such a beautiful movie, and the subject matter is so weird. It's just awesome. Next is the Final Destination franchise. This is a franchise that I absolutely adore. I've always loved it. Something keeps calling me to it just to find out the weird different ways people can probably die in real life. But it's just such a franchise that I keep drawing myself back to, and it's kind of fun. Although it started off more serious, it's gotten more absurd. It's definitely a lot of fun. And kind of following that up has got to be the Saw franchise. Started out very serious, kind of got more fun and ridiculous as things progressed. If you watch them in succession, you'll probably have more fun than be more creeped out. If you watch them separately and individually, you'll probably be more creeped out and scared. But the first one is a classic and started a genre that I think a lot of people weren't expecting, and it's just phenomenal. Next is A Quiet Place, which was John Krasinski's directorial debut. Such a classic movie in terms of being scary, but in its own way. There's a lot of suspense. There are some serious terrors that had me balled up, and it's just such a good movie to check out, and I can't wait for the sequel. Next up is Oculus, which is one that based on a short film. The short film I think was maybe a little bit better, but a lot of the ideas presented in Oculus and the way that it's directed is probably the best part about it and totally worth watching. Next up is The Ritual, which is a Netflix film about 4 friends going off on a final adventure, and some weird stuff happens. Very much a Blair Witch kind of movie, but it's a lot of fun by presenting a lot of different ideas, especially for male characters who are a little bit more of the more machismo types. These ones aren't that, but the way that these characters interact and the sort of twist that's happening is mind-blowing. It's totally worth watching. And last but not least, probably one of my favorite vampire movies of all time, which is The Lost Boys. Such a fun movie, so quotable, I quote it all the time, and it's one of the more interesting twists along with how people sort of progress and become a vampire. It's a very teen 80s movie, but I love it. It's full of so much nostalgia. It's one of the best vampire movies of all time. And with that, we are done with our list. Now, I missed a lot of horror movies. This is not the end-all be-all list, just some recommendations that I think are worth checking out during this time, this season. I'll probably come back next year with a whole new list, who knows? But if you guys think that I missed something very critical, one of the best of all time, make sure you let me know down in the comment section down below. While you're down there, leave a thumbs up if you like this video, as well as hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss out on any future videos from me. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.